Today, I'm excited to have John Chan on the podcast. John is an entrepreneur renowned for his expertise in web UX design and digital marketing. Born in Hong Kong and raised in Vancouver, John dropped out of university at the age of 19 to start his own web design consultancy. Since then, he's worked for several prestigious companies, including UBC and Basecamp, before co-founding 2X Growth Agency. The agency specializes in helping e-commerce and DTC brands grow and scale with paid ads and ad creative development. Under John's leadership, the agency has managed over $6 million of ad spend and helped generate over $30 million in revenue for their clients. John, I'm excited about this conversation today. Thanks for being here.
Thank you for having me. I'm very excited to be here as well.
Welcome to Catalytic Leadership, the podcast designed to help leaders intentionally grow and thrive. Here is your host, author and leadership and executive coach, Dr. William Attaway.
I would love for you to share a little bit of your story with our listeners, particularly around your journey and your development as a leader.
Sure.
How did you get started?
Sure. I think for me, it started somewhat by accident because when I first started my career, I dropped out of school when I was 19. And mostly at the time because I felt disenchanted with school, not really thinking that I was going to be an entrepreneur. But as you alluded to in introduction, I started doing web development as a freelancer because that was sort of the skill sets that I picked up in high school. But over the course of the year, there was a common thread in the way that I developed my career and as I progressed to become a leader myself. A lot of it came down to figuring out how to solve the next immediate challenge or problem that I was focusing on. And so in my 20s, a large part of it was accumulating different technical skills that was needed at the time between myself and the organization that I was serving. And so if you were to break down the careers, there's basically I would say three major arcs, right? Where the first part of the skill sets that I developed was around doing web design and web development. And that led to a career doing user experience development or user experience research because I was studying the people that I was serving behind the scenes. But at that point, eventually led to developing skills around analytics and being able to measure the designs that I was improving. I'll fast forward a bit, but between the initial parts and of developing design skills, at some point it led to around realizing that in the way that I shaped the skills that I had, I needed to have better leverage around leading and managing a different team. And so between the design career, eventually started a software company with my wife, where we were building productivity software between 2013 or so to the end of 2016. And during that phase of the career, I wasn't approaching company building from a leadership perspective. I was building it based from a product designer perspective, thinking that I had, was always like this quote unquote, the smartest person in the room. Narrative says I wasn't. But a large part of it was because I was not thinking about what it meant to be a CEO. And for a while, I shied away from that term because it felt pretentious to be the CEO of a 3-person company until somebody really snapped that out of me. Right. And realize that I was ignoring the job description of what it meant to lead, of what it meant to set a direction for the company and rallying everybody to get a sense there's a common goal that we're trying to achieve together. And so long story short, the current business that we run right now, as you alluded to, is a marketing agency. We're a small team. We're 8 people between full-timers and part-timers and contractors. And a large part of the way I see the work now is it used to be that I think about my role on the team with all the technical skills that I built up was around making a direct contribution to the end product. For software at the company at the time, I was making direct changes to features and product. Nowadays, when I think about the way that we serve our clients is I think about company building and leadership as building end products with one step removed, as in rather than having the strongest technical skills to build the client deliverables directly, which we sometimes still do. A large part of it is about directing the team and enabling them to create end products that we're really proud of, that we know are revenue generating and are helping the clients that we serve. And so when I think about one step removed, it's, rather than me working on the direct product, I think about me creating the company culture or creating the training or the coaching or the feedback that leads to the end fulfillment product. And so that one step removed layer of abstraction really helps shape the way that we guide the way I think about leadership.
When we talked about this previously, you mentioned that in your first company, you learned a lot about leadership by making some mistakes.
For sure.
And I think we can all resonate with that. Would you share one or two of those mistakes that you made that you realized, and how you came to that point of understanding, oh wow, this is not the way to go?
For sure. I mean, I kind of alluded to this, right? I think a large part of it was identity. And so the punchline to, I think, the major mistake, I think, what characterizes a great leader and also the failings of a poor one is their ability to listen empathetically. And so I would characterize the way that I approached how I ran the previous company was, again, coming from a background where I developed a lot of strong technical skills, I know I was smart and I was good at the work that I did. But if you're in a situation where you're always the one that was driving the right ideas because you're the smartest person in the room, it just means that you're not setting up the right conditions for the company to succeed, because the company is not you as a single person. And so the lesson actually came from, again, a chance encounter where I told somebody that I detested calling myself a CEO. And I think there's two parts to this. One was identity, about recognizing what it meant to be a CEO, what it meant to lead. And it was a very deliberate process in the second company that we built, where I tried to think about what it meant to be a leader and how I would, change the way that I approach certain things. But the way that I really understood what it meant to really listen was through a mentor of mine, and it was kind of a long process. And I think one of the advice that he gave me at the time, which seemed counterintuitive at the time, was that he basically said, John, you think fast, you talk fast. And what it also meant that is oftentimes you're not actually listening. You're monologuing in your own head as you think you're listening. And so it meant that a lot of times you had reactionary responses to the people that you talk to or the people that are around you. And it also comes as a form of disrespect. And so when you realize that you weren't deliberately trying to do that, but it came across in that way, you really had to slow down, and you really had to, practice a lot of, certain things like active listening or being an empathetic listener. And I think over time, when I realized that, when I had certain people that I initially would not have the patience to listen to, but if I waited, or if I let sort of the initial sort of reaction subside, more often than not, I'll have more useful things to say, or I'll be more thoughtful, more impactful. And more often than not, what it meant to be a leader was really just considering all the different perspectives from different backgrounds, different employees, different advisors, different customers, people that are different than you, right? Where they can share their perspective, not necessarily right or wrong, but a way for you to consider how their worldview shapes whatever you're about to say. And I think that had really a poignant impact in the way that I think about leadership, and maybe I'm a lot more effective compared to where I came from.
I really appreciate the transparency that you're showing and sharing that, because I think a lot of leaders really struggle owning a lack of empathetic listening. They say, but I'm in the meeting, I'm listening, I'm asking questions, I'm listening. But there's a world of difference between hearing and listening. And what you're describing is that deeper level.
Absolutely. And I think it wasn't, I don't think I necessarily think of it as transparent as much as I think I was able to detect a monologue. I think that's what it was. It was a sense of self-awareness. Somebody reflected on me. And I think in a certain way, I think of it as lucky, right? Because when people give us certain feedback, especially honest feedback, especially the ones that are hardest to hear, and they're effectively covering our blind spots, right? And it's often easy for, if you're judgmental or if you're quick to see analysis or certain type of things, it's easy for you to see those type of things, but it's really hard to see that reflection for yourself, right? And so I think of it as lucky, and I think of it as being surrounded by people that have the patience to get through to me, right? And I think part of it is also the fact that I work with my wife, right? So it's like you can sort of imagine sort of the dynamics of a business relationship where you're mixing business and personal, and she did really have a very monumental change in the way that I think and see the way I approach business dealings or relationships.
Let's talk about that for just a second, because I know a lot of people who, as a business owner, cannot imagine working with their spouse. They see that as being just a landmine-ridden field. How have you found success in that? What are some things you've learned in working with your spouse?
It's funny you say that, because the punchline is, right, the advice is like, don't do it. And it's for good reason, right? No, but it's good for good reason, because, you know, it's not all bad. The real answer is because it's not all bad, right? But it's also like incredibly difficult. And so, I think what really worked for us, I wouldn't dare to give advice, because I think when I look at other strong couples, like business owners and entrepreneurs, I think what really makes them work, I think there's different sort of like dynamics and styles that I can't speak for them, but I think what I can speak for us is that whether if it's a spouse or any business relationship, really, like any business partners, is when things go well, it's generally very easy to be amicable. It's very easy to be in agreement with everybody, right? But it's when things go wrong, right, and how you navigate the power dynamics and the struggles, and do you blame? Do you talk about like it's how you fight that really dictates the strength of the relationship. And so the hard part is about navigating that is again very challenging, because separating and delineating between a business relationship and a personal one is, you have to be able to, for example, be mad at the other person for something that happened at work, and then go home and just be like, not bring that home like to work, right? And so if you're able to do that, and I think that certainly helps. And I think a large part of us working well together and maturing well together really boils down to fighting well and being able to complement each other's strengths and weaknesses. And so I think part of it is also the fact that we did that in our 20s, right? And so we kind of like recognize the sense of progression that we both experienced. And so over the years, as when we've had long nights and long fights, right? Of course, like any couple would. But it's hard not to be optimistic as the years roll on and that things get progressively better, right? And so having that sort of condition or the environment that forged our relationship in business and in personal lives, I think it just makes us level one a lot more, and just be optimistic and be hopeful for what we're about to face in the future.
I know you said you're reticent to give advice there, but you just shared some really practical wisdom that I think is going to really benefit people who are listening. And I hope people are paying attention to that, because this is an area that a lot of people struggle with. If they're working with a spouse, or even sometimes if they're not, the tension in the environment can create so many relational problems. And leaders, part of our responsibility as leaders is communication. Part of our responsibility is learning to navigate difficult conversations. And are there any relationships that are more important than those at home?
Of course.
Right? We would say that's most important. And yet so often I see leaders dodging those conversations. Something they would not do at work most of the time. They would have the difficult conversation, but they're dodging the ones at home. And you figured out a way to navigate those waters in such a way that you're able to bring those two worlds together. So well done.
Well, thank you. And I appreciate that thought. I mean, again, I think I attribute it to luck in a certain sense, because, as with any company or family, it's not just the one person's individual, I'm here on the mic talking, but a lot of it really comes down to the dynamics on both sides, right? It takes a village to build a company, and likewise, it takes two to dance, right? And so I think a lot of credit also goes to Jen and the way that she handles me and manages sort of my shortcomings. And I think in any relationship, I think people are generally hopeful and optimistic about relationships if either side can admit that if there's times that they're right about a certain thing, that they stand by that and stand by that opinion. But it's more important to be able to know when to back off and say, you know what, I made a bad call there. I was wrong about that. I'm sorry for making that call. And I think people that can, that I think usually is the hardest part around navigating these type of conversations, and having the self-awareness to recognize that's what's happening. So I think that was a really big part to how we manage our dynamic.
I like that. I think that team mindset, that understanding, we're on the same team. It's me and you against the problem. It's not me against you.
Yes,
I think that mindset is so healthy.
absolutely,
That's something that my wife and I aspire to as well.
absolutely,
And something that I'll often teach clients.
absolutely.
It's not me against you. It's me and you against the problem.
Yes,
Now let's tackle it together because we're on the same team.
absolutely. I'm really glad you said that, because I think it was one of those things that was a really important early lesson for us as well, because oftentimes when you think about any type of conflict or interpersonal conflict, again, with your spouse or partner or somebody else, is the fact that if you can both take a step back and look at the problem, sometimes it's a direct problem, but sometimes it's often a misunderstanding. But having an external sort of when you're in the middle of a fight and you're able to take a step back and extrapolate that and say, hey, what is the thing that we're aligned on? And basically say, hey, is it a common misunderstanding or a common goal that we're trying, or a common objective that we're trying to work towards? It helps you find alignment in the midst of that conversation, because it's very easy in a fight to say, oh, you should have done this, or I should have done that, or if it gets into you versus me versus us versus a common objective, a common misunderstanding. That's a very important dynamic that again, we were lucky that we were had that instilled in us early on.
So good. Because you have stepped into a CEO mindset, which a lot of people don't make that turn, because you have, it has created more margin in your life. And you are investing that margin in a number of different places. I saw that you also invest in real estate, in rental estate, right?
That's right.
You have multiple properties, and you are having sold 3 of those. And you are a black belt in Taekwondo.
That's true.
And I was looking at this. You have represented Team Canada 3 times internationally.
That's right.
I'm curious, this is the marketing world, real estate, and Taekwondo. Are there things that you have learned in these other ventures that have helped you to develop and grow as a leader?
Of course. I think I'll start with martial arts, and so I spent probably 12 years competing competitively. So I'm retired now, right? I spent 12 years competing competitively in Taekwondo, and again, in each one of those things, the common thread behind how to progress and do well in any particular field that you get into is having really good mentors and having really good guiding posts, so that you can benchmark what is it that you're trying to do, and not making the same mistakes that someone else may have. And so in martial arts, the school that I originally started with, that my parents placed me in, they're good people, but frankly, it wasn't a very good school for competitive environments. And so what it meant was that when I first started competing, one of the things that I was, again, lucky to come upon was we had a national tournament locally. So we didn't have to travel very far. It was juniors. This was 2001, right? And that was my first foray into competitive sports. And what happened was, because there was a national tournament happening in hometown, it meant that the different schools in the local regions provided BC team training, meaning that I got exposure to different styles of training from other schools. And what that allowed me to do was gain the visibility of the conditions and environments I was in, and it showed me the very differences of having good instruction or versus one that was not so great. And so it meant that whenever I get into any new endeavors, right? And so, fast forward a few years when I got into real estate, it wasn't a complete deliberate sort of like intent to do. It was something that I, when I going back to my earlier thought about dropping out of school, one of the catalysts for recognizing that school wasn't really necessarily the right environment for me was I read this book, Rich Dad Poor Dad, and in that book, it talks about minding your own business, and it talks about through in the narratives around one, about finding great mentors, but also it does talk a lot about real estate. And so while I was, competing and I was training, it just kind of opened up my eyes, and I started asking people around me and realizing that, oh, wait a second, there are people that are practicing what the book was preaching. And it led to conversations around, oh, hey, you run a business, right? It was like, for example, like a teammate of mine is like, hey, like, what is that like? And so that sort of curiosity and those early questions led into one thing led to another. next thing you know, I find myself being brought around to networking events or being exposed to different projects and deals that they're working on. And one of those questions eventually led to, okay, that's interesting. Well, how do I buy my own real estate property? And then, and the next thing you know, I got introduced to investors. A lot of it was just, early exposure and the curiosity and in most cases, right, especially people that have hard-earned experiences, and if you ask them a very direct or deliberate question, most people are really more than happy to help, more than happy to share, because everyone wants to share that sort of experience with somebody, especially if they know they can help you shortcut a lot of the tough experiences that they had to go through. And so, so between the three different fields, a lot of it was about paying attention to people that are good around me in those respective fields, asking the right questions and then be exposed to it, and recognizing that if you do that enough times, you'll get to progress in each of those fields very quickly.
I think that's so brilliant. Asking the questions, seeking out the counsel, seeking out the mentors. This is what differentiates, I believe, high performance leaders, because they're not ashamed to admit what they don't know. And they are constantly asking questions. You will never get the right answers unless you ask the right questions. This is why I've hired coaches for so many years who help me to see what I can't see, because you can't see the whole picture when you're in the frame. But by having the right questions, you can shortcut, right? You can avoid some of those ditches that you would drive into otherwise. And you can go farther than you would have gone on your own. And you can get there faster.
Absolutely.
And I think that is so incredibly intelligent. And what great counsel for everybody listening. If you think you know it all and you don't need to ask for advice, then you do not have a teachable spirit. And I think that is one of the key components of what it means to truly be catalytic as a leader. And that's what I see in you, John.
Thank you. And again, I always still attribute it to luck, right? I mean, there's definitely certain aspects of my upbringing where it was a very deliberate choice, no doubt about it. But I think a lot of it really comes down to, again, chance encounters early on. I think I had just really young, like great role models when I was young, right? And again, being in a martial arts environment where there's naturally a natural progression in the way that you develop a particular skill, right? It's hard to see that sort of translation in marketing or in business. There's no clear delineation between level 1 to level 10, right? Or in the martial arts environment, a white belt to a black belt. But it just meant that I was looking for that invisible sort of like progression. And but similarly, again, that being in that initial sort of like school in that environment for such a long time and recognizing that it wasn't really the right or best environment for me to take the sport seriously, that opened my eyes up about the importance of not just any instruction, but good instruction, because it could be the difference between being led astray versus the difference between being world class, right? And again, that exposure was again very lucky, because if I looked at the fact that there was peers in back in my upbringing where they didn't necessarily had the same opportunity, even though they had the same chances, it just meant that when I did have the opportunities in front of me, I metaphorically, I seized it. I really went after it, because I knew it was hard to come by. And I think I approach a lot of our work today with a similar mindset, because when I think about different brands or clients that work with us or choose to work with us, it's a privilege in a sense, right? Because part of the initial motivation to start the agency was a recognition that when we built the first company, that we felt that we didn't have it turns out we were actually technically very strong, or strong enough to build these businesses, but we couldn't commercialize the first business. So we felt that we had a skill that was lacking. And so part of the motivation to run the agency was because agencies are a great environment for exposure to a lot of different business models. It's a lot of exposure to a lot of the patterns about different organizations. And it just allowed us to sample culture, and meant that we met other great leaders for me to model off from. And so I don't take that for granted, and again, I think of it as luck that we get to be in the work that we get to do today.
The agency world is a fantastic incubator for so many different ideas and insight into so many different areas. But it starts with that teachable spirit. And I'm gonna push back a little bit, and I'm gonna say I think you have made that choice in so many areas of your life. You have made that choice intentionally to be teachable, to learn, to grow. And so here's my question coming off of that. How are you these days staying on top of your game? How are you leveling up your leadership skills with what your team is going to need you to have a year, 3 years, 5 years from now
Of
as
course.
their leader?
I mean, the short answer and the punchline is really boiling down to like keeping your eyes open for what the I'll put it this way. I think one way to think about being a great autodidact or being able to teach yourselves in any particular field, whether if it's leadership or technical skills, is being able to diagnose what your deficiencies and your blind spots are. Because just like a doctor, when you watch someone diagnose an underlying condition, if you don't have a lot to go by, the types of options that are available to you to cure somebody is endless. You could try all kinds of different things that would lead to the wrong answer. And so I think likewise, I think a lot of people in this world today, especially with the fact that we're on the internet, there's so many different things you could learn, but being able to be selective about what you should learn right now and what is specific to the deficiency that you have, I think is paramount. And so from a soft skill or leadership position, when I think about, again, going back to recognizing that I lacked the skills of what it meant to be a great leader, meant that I paid attention to what a lot of other great leaders looked like, right? And so sometimes it's about direct reading something, or it could other just be observing people that you really respected, and you look at how they conduct themselves, how they handle and manage different difficult decisions. You could even see it for a TV show, what have you. But the point is just being observant about the way that people conduct themselves as a way to model after. I think that's a really important thing. But likewise, when you think about what there's a lot of facets to leadership, right? Some people are about HR oriented, other people are people oriented, and what have you. I think in my case, recognizing your own strengths and weaknesses is a very important characteristic, and also being able to recognize strengths and weaknesses for other people. And so in my environment, because I've always been very good at learning, what it meant was that we had I had a certain knack or skill around teaching, and I think it's not about necessarily giving good advice or what have you. A lot of it is about breaking down the thought processes that I have and be able to articulate it in a way so that somebody else can understand, so that they can reproduce the same result. And so in an agency environment, what it often meant was that if we're learning a new platform or a new product or new tool, especially in the marketing world where everything changes every few years, right? Being able to pay attention to and separate all the noise and be able to figure out which parts are important signals or important to dissect was an important skill, and be able to learn that very quickly and be able to pass information on to the rest of the team so that everybody else pays attention. I think that's something that I inherently have as a strength, and it meant that people look to me in their own lives as they're on their team and they're trying to progress in their own careers, right? It's like they could have chose to work with anybody, but why are they working with you? And if they didn't have a sense of, oh, I would do well working with you because I could learn XYZ skills, because you're able to either articulate it in a way that's hard for me to get from somebody else, or that I was given opportunities that's hard for somebody else. Forget about being a leader. Why should anyone follow you in any venture that you get into? Why take all the risks and what have you? And being able to see that from the other side, I think really helps. And so recognizing my own strength as a coach or a teacher, and be able to really stand by that and play that out, I think is a really important part.
I agree. Is there a book that has made a big difference in your journey? Something that you would recommend to the leaders who are listening? If you haven't read this, you really need to take.
For leadership, I have a hard time pointing to a specific book, right? I think a lot of it really boils down to observing. Actually, I do have one now that I come to think of it. The Hard Thing The Hard Thing About Hard Things, Ben Horowitz, I think was a really important book, because I think for me, it made me recognize the difficulty of what it really meant to be a CEO. And I remember one particular sort of anecdote or story that was told about basically how to take advice from other people, including knowing when to reject it. And so, I won't give away the whole narrative, but there's a lot to decipher it. But one part was that there was a particular instance where there's a legendary executive coach that was basically strong background, strong reputation, and but there was a very difficult situation that the CEO found themselves in the story, right? And because you're the only person that have the full context of a particular situation, knowing when to follow advice is really important. but knowing when to reject a particular advice is also really important. And it's a really tough balance to follow, because how do you know that you're rejecting a certain advice because you're being stubborn versus you have conviction that you do recognize that based on the different advice, really great advice from multiple people that you've heard, that the call that you have to make and be able to live with that. I think it articulated what it really meant internally for a lot of the tough decisions and struggles that you have to go through. And I think that really stayed with me. So The Hard Thing About Hard Things is, I think, a really good book about leadership.
I haven't read that, but it sounds absolutely fascinating. I'm adding that to my to-read list. Thank you for that. Often people walk away from an episode like this, a conversation like this, John, with one big idea, one big takeaway. If you got to decide what you want that one big takeaway to be for people to walk away with,
sure,
what would that be?
I think for me, one of the advice that I try to follow and I try to think about, today, and I think what I made a right call on is that I focused a lot of the skills that I developed over the years around how to add more value to whatever organization that I bring. And I think it's a very generic way to think about it, right? But it's like, if I think about, what are the skills required to take a company from 0 to 1 million? Or how do you join an organization and help it grow from 1 million to 5? It's like, when you have the audacity and you really take that to heart, it's really hard to create those conditions and environment and not be able to make 100K for yourself or make 200K for yourself. It's like when you add value to a particular organization, it's really hard not to do well for yourself. And I really try to stick with that. And I think that's part of the reason why we're running XC, where we're our raise on debt trail is to help the companies that we serve grow. And so I really try to stick by that. And similarly, it was useful advice early on in my career. As is good advice for me right now. And it's just that the goalpost moves, right? Because at some point it was about building technical skills, and then that transitioned to building soft skills, whether if it's leadership and having a greater leverage with being able to have a larger impact, or the fact that a lot of efforts is now a team effort. But I've always looked at that as a guiding compass of what to do next and what kind of skills I need to develop and be able to diagnose. So I think that would be the thing that I would try to leave people with. How do you provide value and help to grow the value of an organization that you bring?
Well, great advice. I know people are going to want to stay connected to you and continue to learn from you, John. What is
for sure?
Best
always have to connect and meet with different people. It doesn't have to be someone you learn from. But you can find me on Twitter, and you can find me on LinkedIn. Our agency is 2x.agency. That's the URL. And if you want to find me on social, it's JTCCHAN. So JTC Chan. So I'm pretty sure the links are provided in show notes.
Outstanding. John, I so appreciate your time and your authenticity today and sharing so much from what you've learned so far in your journey. Thanks for joining me for this episode today. As we wrap up, I'd love for you to do two things. First, subscribe to this podcast so you don't miss an episode. And if you find value here, I'd love it if you would rate it and review it. That really does make a difference in helping other people to discover this podcast. Second, if you don't have a copy of my newest book, Catalytic Leadership, I'd love to put a copy in your hands. If you go to catalyticleadershipbook.com, you can get a copy for free. Just pay the shipping so I can get it to you, and we'll get one right out. My goal is to put this into the hands of as many leaders as possible. This book captures principles that I've learned in 20 plus years of coaching leaders in the entrepreneurial space, in business, government, nonprofits, education, and the local church. You can also connect with me on LinkedIn to keep up with what I'm currently learning and thinking about. And if you're ready to take a next step with a coach to help you intentionally grow and thrive as a leader, I'd be honored to help you. Just go to catalyticleadership.net to book a call with me. Stay tuned for our next episode next week. Until then, as always, leaders, choose to be catalytic.
Thanks for listening to Catalytic Leadership with Dr. William Attaway. Be sure to subscribe wherever you listen to podcasts so you don't miss the next episode. Want more? Go to catalyticleadership.net.